Why don't we first go do some introductions? So let's just do. Why don't we just take the presentation down and we can just all say hello to each other and identify ourselves, and then we'll get started. So I'll start off. I'm Sam Gold, Director of RiverCog, and joining me from RiverCog staff are Senior Transportation Planner Rob Harrimet, our GIS Planner Kevin Armstrong, Elislo Presti, Paula Fernald, and is there anyone else from RiverCog that I'm missing? Okay, well, let's see. Why don't we have our town representatives introduce themselves. Why don't you go ahead, Carrie?
Hi, Carrie Dupez, the land use official for the town of Essex.
Sandy?
Hi, Sandy Prislow. I'm a member of the energy team in Chester, and we're currently investigating, excuse me, installing EV chargers. So this is particularly pertinent.
Great. And I see, is it Lam one?
Yeah, David Lam. I'm the third selectman for Lyme.
Oh, and are you the incoming first selectman?
Yes, I will be next month.
All right. Well, we will. I look forward to welcoming you to the COG. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah. And then why don't our guests, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Sure. So my name is Mark Reel. I work in developing commercial energy efficiency and EV projects here at Earthlight Technologies.
My name is Stefan Hartman. I also work with Mark and developing EV charger installations on the commercial side. And I also manage the teams that do commercial solar and energy efficiency as well. So there's a lot of cross talk that can happen in these energy related projects.
Great. And then Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike. I work on the project management team for solar and EV.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And why don't you kick it off?
All right, so I guess I'll reshare my screen. 1 second. I don't use Zoom as much as I use some other platforms. So here we go. That should do it.
So I'll probably kick us off and go through the first, 8 or 9 slides, and then Mark can dive into the specifics on the solar program, and Mike is here as well to talk a little bit more about site conditions and any technical questions that might come up as well. So by way of introductions, Earthlight Technologies are based in Ellington, Connecticut. We, as I hinted before, we have a lot of experience in energy efficiency, solar design and installation, EV charging, obviously. And we're a DAS approved contractor for all of these services as well. So we have a lot of municipal experience, and we're a turnkey provider. We have about 24 electricians on staff, engineering capabilities and talent, our own project management. And we're actually, we just finished, actually, Mark, if you want to advance 2 slides there. There's our team, and then we just finished a net zero facility up in Ellington, Connecticut. Well, it's planned to be net zero. We're still finishing some of the technology, but geothermal, solar, battery storage. It's hyper insulated. It's really a state-of-the-art building. So we really are trying to practice what we preach. Go ahead, Mark. Yeah. So the agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the trends in EV and why more and more folks are looking into it in Connecticut in particular. We'll spend a little time on the technology basics, the types of installations that you might be considering and where they would be best installed and use cases for that. And then we're going to dive a little bit more into considerations for how to site your locations. And then finally, this should only take about 15-20 minutes, I think. And then we get to the Q&A, and we're happy to hang out as long as the folks on the call have questions. Excuse me. So Eversource and UI, and I believe everybody that we would be talking to would be an Eversource based town. Correct me if I'm wrong. Eversource and UI have a shared electric vehicle charging equipment incentive. I'll just refer to it as the Eversource program. If you're in a municipal utility by any chance, that would not qualify there, but the municipalities sometimes would mimic or be open to mimicking whatever the Eversource program is. So this would be specific to Eversource or UI. They carved them out for public spaces, workplace and fleet vehicle type installations. So workplace and fleet are kind of the same thing. The idea there is that it's a business or an organization that wants to have its own charging infrastructure installed, and it's not necessarily open to the public. And then of course the public is everything else. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's intended to be used by anyone and everyone, pretty much 24/7 access to those ports. So something to think about.
So just a question about that. So if you wanted to limit it to hours of operation, that would not be allowed.
Mark, do you have, I don't want to speak with total certainty on that. Mark, do you have feedback to that question?
Yeah, so if it's not going to be open to the public 24/7, then I would think that that would be considered either a workplace or a fleet charging opportunity. And so it would be more subject to those rules, which as we look at those, at some of the slides we have coming up, that's not necessarily a dramatic change in the scope of the project that we would be looking at.
Chargers to 4 chargers, yeah.
Exactly.
All right.
And I will say that the Eversource team is small and flexible. So if there were reasonably, allocated hours for public use, that coincided with business hours and things like that, it maybe no overnight parking where it was a limitation. I suspect that they would review it on a case-by-case basis. Mark, let me know if that sounds unrealistic based on your experience. The program does allow for future-proofing as well. So if you're thinking you want to do 2 or 4 now and maybe expand into the future, the program will provide accommodations with incentives to do that, so that these installations can scale as the adoption of EV scales in Connecticut. Networking and maintenance programs are available. So if you want to manage your uptime and your ability to charge users for charging station use or not, if you want to have some people be able to use it for free and some people have to pay a fee. All of that is part of the technology now. It's no longer just plugging in an equipment as if they're, an electric vehicle into the wall, similar to a vacuum cleaner or anything like that. You have a lot of insights into what's going on with the equipment. Also, there's a lot of state level mandates rolling out. The governor's plan to electrify the grid, to see more and more EVs on the road. There's a lot of fleet conversion goals out there to get school buses or maybe city buses converted to EV. So we're not really going to talk about that too much, but maybe at the municipal level, you guys are running into this, where there's programs being rolled out seemingly every month with new incentives. So there's definitely a trend heading in the direction of electric mobility. Go ahead, Mark. So specifically on the Eversource program, it covers 100% of the make-ready costs and 50% of the charging equipment costs. So the make-ready is going to be your trenching, any electrical upgrades that your equipment might need. If you're bringing in a really big, a high-speed charger, you need a new transformer and a meter, that could all be covered under the program. The charging equipment is the fixture itself that the users are going to interact with, the plugs, if you will. 50% of that would be covered. There are some costs that are excluded from the program. We may spend a little time on that later in the call, but just know that generally turnkey, whatever the project cost is, you could easily expect about 70% of that project to be covered upfront by the utility incentive. Now there are caps on this. So if you're doing a level 2 installation, we'll get into what level 2 and DC fast charger, what all that means. But your basic EV charger, there's a $20,000 cap incentive level for your baseline, meaning that's the standard incentive. But then there's a $150,000 cap for the DC fast chargers. And again, we'll get into what those are in a moment. Environmental justice communities, or EJCs, have a higher incentive cap. So you can either do more chargers and get more incentive, or it'll cover a larger percentage of whatever that installation cost is. So for level 2, you're talking $40,000, so it effectively doubles. And for DC fast chargers, $250,000. We're finding the DC fast chargers in environmental justice zones with that $250,000 incentive has been very appealing. So there is a link. I can make these slides available to everybody on the call so they can click this link, but you may already be familiar with it. There are environmental justice zones. Mark, can you go ahead and advance the slide?
Yeah, Stefan, I was actually going to mention, you shared that anecdote with us earlier this morning about a town official you were speaking to who wasn't even necessarily fully aware of the extent of the environmental justice zones in his municipality. So I think it sort of bears repeating. It's well worth your while just to open that link and look and see where those opportunities exist, if they exist in your communities.
Yeah, and I believe the next slide, we have an example of this.
It's actually 2 slides ahead.
2 slides, yeah, if you don't mind, go ahead and skip down to it.
Yeah.
So this is my hometown of Brantford, Connecticut. I was curious, so I opened it up. We're not a quote unquote distressed municipality, which is often another term thrown around for environmental justice communities. But within the town, there were environmental justice communities. So the town of Brantford used this intel to say, well, what projects do we have coming on? How would EV installations in these locations advance, the town of Brantford's electric conversion goals? And they were able to use that as a way to kind of filter the sites that they started looking at. So again, this link is a great way for any town official to see if there's any low-hanging fruit opportunity within the town. It gives you just a little bit more solutions budget to solve for any installation challenges that might arise. I want to go back a slide there, Mark. So this is a snip right from the Eversource webpage. Again, it's a recap of what we've already spoken about, but there are minimum requirements for some of these. So if you're the bar is lower if you're making it public. So if you want to put a couple of EV chargers out front of the library or the town hall, you only have to put 2 ports. However, if it's going to be restricted to the public, if it's something that you want to use for fleet vehicles, or if any of the businesses in town want to do this for their workplace, it's the same $20,000 incentive cap, but the obligation is to install 4 ports to participate in the incentive program. For the fast chargers, there's no non-public option. So all of the fast chargers would have to be available to the public. And again, going back to what we talked about earlier, that generally means 24/7 or on a case-by-case basis. All right, Mark. And I'm going to throw it over to Mark to talk a little bit about what level 2 and DCFC all that means.
Right. So again, introduced myself at the start, but my name is Mark Reel. And so we've had obviously a lot of terms we've thrown around. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these terms, but there's always a chance that somebody isn't. So just to kind of further define what we're talking about. So when we're talking about chargers, you hear terms like level 2, level 1, in some cases you hear mentioned. DC fast charge. You may also hear people talking about level 3 chargers, but so level 2 is sort of what I would consider to be the baseline level of performance that is sort of acceptable today to install in any sort of non-residential application. And even frankly, most residential applications should be probably a level 2 charger at least. A level 2 charger. So a level 2 charger is sort of the standard bollard mounted, relatively small form factor charger that you guys may already have in some of the municipalities today. So there's a number of different manufacturers that offer them. We have a couple pictures below of some installations. One is a charge point unit, which is a very common, popular choice. We also have a juice bar, which is another manufacturer, another very common, popular choice. And there are many, many manufacturers that make many high quality level 2 chargers. What they have in common is that they're all AC chargers. So they're all actually passing AC power to the vehicle. And they will vary in output somewhere between, generally speaking, somewhere between 3 and at the outside 10 kW delivered per port. There are cases where it can go higher, but generally between 3 and 10 kW per port. Generally speaking, oftentimes these units will have 2 ports on them, and both of those ports will allow simultaneous charging. So you could have 2 cars plugged in, parked next to each other, both plugged in, both receiving power. And typically, when we think about the range that those chargers can provide, a good sort of estimate that you can use to think about it is that you'd be providing roughly 20 to 30 miles of range per hour that vehicle is plugged in and charging. So these are very good for overnight parking applications and applications where a vehicle is going to be parked, let's say during a workday. So for example, where I am, my municipality does provide public charging. So I drive in, plug in the morning, work an 8-hour day, and then go back to my car. And by the time I'm there, that car is fully charged. So they're good for longer dwell time applications. They are often offered as an amenity or with a relatively minimal fee for access to cover the cost of power, which is a legitimate cost. They are also often used by municipalities to draw drivers into areas with significant commerce opportunities. So places where there's shopping, retail, restaurants. They're a good draw to your communities for those purposes. The DC fast chargers, which you will also sometimes hear referred to as level 3, are much larger pieces of equipment that can charge vehicles much faster. So they're called DC fast chargers because, unlike the prior example where we were looking at level 2, where you're actually passing alternating current power to the vehicle, in this case, it is passing direct current power to the vehicle. This allows them to charge vehicles much faster. So the average dwell time of a car parked in front of a DC fast charger is going to be between 15 and 60 minutes. At which time a car could reasonably be expected to charge fully or very nearly fully. And so they are typically installed to give people the ability to travel from point A to B when otherwise it would be difficult given the realities of electric car battery ranges. Unlike level 2 chargers, it is much more common to see these chargers monetized. So it is a convenience that you are offering to people. It's a service you're providing to people, which is extremely valuable. So typically, these can be more significant revenue generation opportunities. And again, there's opportunities to site these near restaurants, retail, to give people opportunities to pass time while they're waiting for their vehicle to be fully charged. And this is very important. So this networking component is very important. A lot of chargers that have been installed in the past, and a lot of chargers that I've seen installed and that had been installed over the years in municipalities were, you could call them dumb chargers, which is not necessarily intended to be a pejorative, but they aren't smart. They're not communicating. They're not reporting. They are essentially just a very fancy extension cord that somebody is allowed to plug in and use. Today, most of the time when we're talking about installing chargers, we're talking about installing chargers that are fully networked. So those chargers will be smart appliances that will be capable of much more sophisticated reporting, maintenance tracking, access management, power management. They'll unlock significant additional capabilities. And what they'll help to do is they'll help to avoid the situation that many of us who drive EVs are familiar with, where we go to plug in our vehicles because we need to charge. We find a charger and it turns out that charger is non-functional. these units will actually allow you to proactively monitor them to make sure that they're up. And if they, for some reason they go down, to diagnose what's going on and get somebody out to repair them as soon as possible to minimize downtime on these chargers, which is obviously very important. So typically what we will do is we would install chargers that are networked via cellular technology. So they can be sited where you don't have existing facilities, where you don't have existing networking, or where it would be inconvenient to try to run networking to them. This also allows them to be more secure. They're not a potential entry into your city and town's IT networks, which is a very important consideration, frankly, on both sides. And so they'll allow those chargers to be much more successful installations than some of the set and forget chargers that have been installed in the past. And finally, just to kind of, again, compare and contrast what these different chargers will enable and how they typically perform. A level 2 charger is much more economical to install and operate. They're much lower cost and they dispense power much more slowly. They can be added to existing electrical services. Now you can also, in cases where it's advantageous, install a new electrical service to serve that equipment. And there are times in which that's a very good idea, but it's much easier to take an existing building with existing electrical infrastructure and just run a circuit outdoors or into a garage to serve this equipment.
I have a question. So
Yes.
how expensive is it to create a brand new service to a parking lot from the street, cables?
So that's a complex question. And Mike D, I'm wondering if you think there's a good answer that you can give them sort of sight unseen, or if it's kind of too site specific.
I can touch on that in the next couple of slides, and go over pricing of electrical, tapping to the electrical service and putting in new services.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got a good answer to that coming along. So just jumping back to the slide that we're on, in general with level 2 chargers, we do encourage you to kind of think carefully about where charging should be located on a site. It makes a lot of sense to try to locate EV charging spaces near where there is existing electrical infrastructure, just to try to minimize site work costs like trenching, which can significantly increase project costs. And it's also useful to consider locations where it is desirable that a car will be parked for an extended period of time. So the classic examples are things like workplaces. If you were to put in a level 2 EV charger at town hall, it's a great opportunity for employees who are going to be working at their desks or working in their departments for a significant period of time to drive in, plug in, and over the course of a working day, get a full charge. Or in areas near retail, near dining opportunities, where you're going to want people to come in and spend some time and some money at some of your local businesses. And that's a fantastic opportunity there. To contrast with DC chargers, they're much more complex installations and that they require much more ongoing maintenance. They generally, and I would say nearly to the point of exclusion, require a new electrical service. There are cases where they can be added to an existing service, but generally speaking, we would be looking at bringing in a new electrical service to serve that equipment. They are higher cost. They also are eligible for much higher incentives. They are much higher throughput. So that dwell time that we were discussing, it may not, in some cases, make a lot of sense to install a DC fast charger where a vehicle would be expected to be stationary for an extended period of time. And so to take that example of a town hall, if you were to mark, and this is not really allowed in the program per se, but a workplace level 2 charger, which you can have restricted to employees or restricted to town personnel, to have a DC fast charger restricted to employees or town personnel would be not, I wouldn't, you'd have to think carefully about whether that was a good idea and whether that was really maximizing the value that that equipment was providing. But if you were to put that at town hall and allow people, which was located such that people could then access some other services, that may make sense. And again, these units can be used to generate significant revenue because you are providing a very important service to people who are using those chargers who need to be able to get from point A to point B. And so you should consider high traffic locations where people are going to be able to plug in and spend anywhere from between 15 to 60 minutes in town waiting for that vehicle to be charged. So do I, and I might have gone through that a little quickly. I'm curious if there are any other questions sort of about this section here, kind of understanding what these different units are and what they're capable of.
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like there's any restriction on charging for charging under this program.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it took me a second to follow what you said there. Yes, no, there are no restrictions. So those units can be offered at no cost. They can be monetized, and with the networking, you can have a hybrid model. So to take an example, like we talked about with possibly citing a level 2 charger at a town hall, you could have town personnel and town employees not pay for access to those chargers, but you could charge a fee to visitors. And that fee would be entirely up to you how to set that. It could be a per kilowatt hour cost. It could be a per session cost. The sky is sort of the limit.
And for the network chargers, can you set hours of operation?
So if you're going to set those chargers as a
For workplace.
non-public,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, you could potentially have them, only active certain times a day, for example.
And then one last question. So I have a plug-in hybrid, and so I charge relatively quickly from my small battery. Can you put incentives or penalties so when you're done charging that you move your car?
Oh yes, that's very common. Actually, particularly on the DC fast charging side. But yes, you can. I think that a lot of times you'll hear it described as a what's the term? Stefan, do you remember what the term is that I'm trying to think of right now?
I think
Called
I was
an idle
once
fee.
charged a penalty
Yes,
for that.
idle fee, exactly. Yes,
Idle
so you can charge an idle fee, and any network charger, generally speaking, there's going to be an application, a mobile application that people are using to get access, and so they'll get a push notification saying, "Hey, your car is charged. In 10 minutes, if you haven't moved it, you're going to pay like $1 a minute or something like that."
And then going back to the vendors that you talked about, so they're turnkey sort of operations. They maintain the chargers, they handle the credit card charging. They handle everything for you, or?
Yeah, so they would handle all of the logistics of the monetization, and then they would make that those funds available to the town, to the site host.
Okay.
Minus fees for processing and that sort of thing. And then there are options also to include maintenance programs on those chargers. It's something that we typically recommend, particularly in the DC fast chargers, because those are much more complex units that have pumps, they have fans, they have active cooling. So it's very important to maintain those units a couple of times a year. Even level 2, much simpler units, but it's still worthwhile to do that. But yes, you have options to have them be a significant partner to you on those programs.
But if you, let's say, I don't remember some of the names of the companies you've listed, but let's say you go to company A, and will you have to buy a proprietary charging station from that company, and then you're sort of stuck with them as long as you have that charging station? Or are there open source charging stations that multiple companies will maintain or work off of?
It's an open market, and so there's both types of solutions out there.
Okay.
And even on the slides that I had up, I had examples of both. So I had a picture of some ChargePoint chargers.
Yep.
ChargePoint is the largest EV charging network
There's,
in
there's my charge
America.
point at that. Oh, it doesn't really show it, but yeah,
Yeah.
charge point. Yeah.
Yeah, I could show you my app too. Yeah, so that they're an example of a vertically integrated solution versus Juice Bar was another manufacturer that I had pictured in some of our slides. That's an example of a manufacturer that is compatible with multiple third-party networks. There are obviously pluses and minuses to either approach. And in particular, some of the proprietary options do offer better uptime, better manageability because their software and their hardware are truly hand in glove versus some other cases where it might be a little bit more ambiguous. But we work with site hosts to decide exactly what the right solution is for each project. So that was sort of a long-winded answer. I hope was that okay.
And Mark, I have a question for you, a little bit different spin.
Sure.
Of the EVs that are out there today or being produced today, some can make use of a DC fast charger, but there seem to be an awful lot that can only use a level 2 charger. So what's sort of the ratio of EVs that can make use of a DC fast charger versus those that cannot?
So these days, I would say, generally speaking, the distinction would come down to, is it a plug-in hybrid vehicle or is it a full battery electric vehicle? So in the case of my household, we have one of each. I use a plug-in hybrid vehicle. My partner uses a battery electric vehicle. So in that case, in our case, it's, one of our vehicles can use a DC fast charger, the other can't. In terms of an actual ratio of vehicles on the road, that's not necessarily a question that I feel super prepared with any quick answer to.
Well, the thought I have on that, Mark, if I may, is that the plug-in hybrids are kind of a transition technology. What you're seeing where the adoption is really surging is on the battery electric vehicle side, where there's no gas engine at all. And all of the new models are coming out with DC fast charging capabilities. So whatever the ratio is now, it's going to continue to tilt more towards DC fast charging capability. And when we consult with hosts, we always like to remind them to consider the functionality of the charging rates. Like, it might be more economical to put a 50 kW charger, let's say, but in practical terms, and as more people use it, you're going to want them in and out more quickly. And 150 kW is probably going to actually mean more users, more revenue, and a better overall project for all involved. And that's due 100% to the adoption rate skyrocketing on battery electric vehicles.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's more or less accurate, Stefan.
And do they make hybrid charging, which, a fast charge DC charger that also allows level 2?
I'm not familiar with anything like that. So what I see is that it's pretty common for a larger site to have a mixture of both, to serve both vehicles, but those would be two separate pieces of equipment, not a single piece of equipment that can do both.
Yeah, I noticed like a big Y that has a bank of Tesla chargers and a charge point charger. So,
Yeah. So that's sort of a classic example.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Tesla, so we didn't have it in the slides, but the DC fast chargers that are incentivized through the program have to be open protocols. They have to be open ports. So in practice, what that means is that any DC fast charger incentivized through the program would have CCS and CHAdeMO ports. They would not have Tesla ports. Tesla, that is a proprietary charging solution. Now, Tesla owners frequently have adapters that give them access to those chargers. So it's not necessarily, I don't think it is anything that should prevent somebody from installing a piece of DC fast charging equipment, but it wouldn't be the Tesla solution. It would be a third party solution that's using an open charging protocol. I hope that made sense to people. Let me know if that didn't. If you have any follow-up questions on that.
So if you can just follow up a little bit more on it. It sounds to me, based on Stephen, your answer, that battery electric vehicles are the future. Hybrids are a transition technology. If we're looking, 5 years down the road, will there be much demand for L2 charging stations, or is the demand really going to be for DC fast chargers?
So that's a great question. What I would say, the way that I think about EV charging is that level 2 is my primary solution. I have a level 2 charger at my home. I have a level 2 charger at work. And I view DC fast charging as a solution to get from point A to point B when otherwise it would be impractical, impossible, etc. So I think there is a strong use case to be made that the vast majority, the almost prohibitively vast majority of ports that will be installed throughout the country will be level 2. DC fast charging ports, very important to enable people to make the trips that they need to make. But I would not encourage anybody to think of that as a primary charging solution for their vehicle.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. If you go to some of the markets where the EV adoption is more mature, you see a lot of level 2. It's kind of like an ABC mantra, always be charging. When you, in Norway and some of these Scandinavian countries where EVs are very, very popular, there's actually level 1 or level 2 chargers on every light pole, for in the main street area. And the idea is that you can plug in, but also pay your parking fee at the same time. Because if you're just charging all the time at level 2, then you never need the high-speed charge. And I'll just speak anecdotally about my situation. I too, like Mark, my partner and I both have an electric vehicle, 100% electric vehicle. I drive about 600 miles a week, 700 miles a week, and I use the DC fast chargers periodically to, today I have to go from Brantford out to Tarrytown, New York and back. So I'll probably be stopping at a DC fast charger for a few minutes today. My wife, on the other hand, I don't think she's ever been to a DC fast charger in the 4 years she's owned her electric vehicle, because she just makes day trips around town. So good question. I think that there's a healthy future for level 2, even though the DC fast chargers get a lot of the attention due to their capabilities.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I sort of see the DC fast chargers as being on transportation corridors, interstate highways, and the level 2's kind of filling in everything else.
Yeah, the state is building out the DC chargers along the interstates. The state DOT received money specifically for that purpose, and it's really for long distance travel where you're going long distance across the country, and you are really stopping to fill up your battery to allow you to go another 300 miles. Whereas getting 30 miles of range in an hour for neighborhood travel, which is mostly less than 30 miles, you're probably coming out in the black in there. So in your battery charge.
True.
Now there are some people who drive a battery electric, but they don't have a garage to charge at home, or they don't have one at their workplace. And so what they'll do is they'll go and visit a DC fast charger once a week, on their way home from work or to work, and charge up and to get their fuel, so to speak, for the entire week. And for that half hour that they're doing that, maybe they're running into town hall to update their beach pass, or going to the grocery store. So it's nice to have a mix of DC fast charger locations that aren't just exclusive to the highways as well. And I can tell you, as again, somebody who uses DC fast chargers on a fairly regular basis, I do consider where it is, because I'm going to be there for a half hour or so. It would be really nice if I could stop into a local cafe. I don't want to go to McDonald's, no offense to McDonald's, but that's not for me, and that's what you're going to find at the highway rest stops most of the time. So I like to take the road less traveled, take a little trip, stop and visit the local town wherever I might be, hang out for a half hour, 45 minutes and spend a few bucks on lunch or coffee. And I don't think I'm alone. I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I currently have nowhere to charge at home. When I charge at work, it's off the exterior outlet on the building. It takes 7.5 hours for my small little battery to get filled, which is a little bit shorter than my work day. So when I go to work, I can charge my car. But yeah, it would be 2 hours if we had level 2.
Right. Right.
So-
Yeah. I had that same situation for a little while.
Out of curiosity, I do not have an electric vehicle, but what is the rate that you would charge someone for charging, and what's the kind of who recoups that cost? Is it the building that's providing the service?
So in the case of, let's say that the municipality was installing chargers on their properties, it would be up to the municipality how those chargers were monetized, and you would be ultimately receiving those revenues. There are a lot of models out there. Generally speaking, the simplest is to charge a rate per kilowatt hour dispensed. So you're paying Eversource or UI. And I think I looked at the list. I'm pretty sure every town in the Council of Governments is an Eversource town. So you're paying Eversource a cost per kilowatt hour, and you would charge the driver a cost per kilowatt hour. And so generally speaking, I've seen that number be anywhere from between 30 cents to 75 cents per kilowatt hour. And you as the town, just round numbers, are probably paying 20 cents per kilowatt hour, I would think, generally. So, you can see there's a delta of between 10 and call it 55 cents per kilowatt hour that could potentially be positive revenues to the town.
Okay, perfect. And then that technology is all in the charging station itself, so you just do it through a credit card or some other?
Yeah, so
Gotcha.
that is typically enabled through the networking. And
Right.
so like with Sam showed his phone where he had the ChargePoint application loaded on his phone, it's typical for EV chargers to have those applications installed and to have those accounts with those different network providers. And so Sam, you're muted.
I also have ChargePort on my phone. I have a number of the apps on my phone because every time you go somewhere else, you have to download another app. But like last week, I installed ChargePort. Yeah, so there's a number of different and they're different networked. And so I assume the town could pick between these various vendors as to who they go with. And I assume they have different rates and different benefits and reasons why you would go for a ChargePort versus ChargePoint. Yeah.
Right.
So let's go to some of the next slides so that Mike DePanfilo can cover some site considerations, because I think that might be of interest to folks thinking about, well, where should I be putting these? And I just want to keep an eye on the time here.
Yeah, so just to reintroduce myself, Mike DePanfilo I'm a project engineer here at Earthlight. I do a lot of the electrical design and manage the development team and project management team. So we're going to get into some numbers of these types of installations, and I want to get it, make it clear that all the quotes that we would be giving you are very site specific, and anything that we're talking about today is to just kind of give you an idea of where to start, where to think about where you want these chargers to go. So to start here, we got a few use cases and a few different types of chargers. Now I'm going with ChargePoint just to show that the three different types of chargers. We have DC, we have workplace, and we have fleet, and they come in different packages and different prices. Now our DC chargers are typically going to be at like the entrances of your facility. Now, I don't know if Mark can kind of give me some. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, can you see my mouse cursor?
Yeah, so generally we're pulling in new services for these DC stations because they pull so much power. Typical buildings cannot handle this amount of draw. So we pull in from the road or we're pulling in off of an existing transformer. So down at the bottom there is an example of we're putting a new pole mounted transformer or dropping in a line to a pad mounted transformer and putting in the chargers nearest to the road. And that is going to be like an ideal situation for DC. You know, we have a short amount of trench, we're going through soft surfaces, and there's, you know, that is going to keep costs down. I want everyone to kind of think about where is the electric coming from, and then where are you putting the chargers, and what is in between there? Are you going through soft surfaces? Are you going through asphalt? Are you going through concrete? All of like the hard surfaces are really going to drive up the cost of your project. And if you can bring the chargers as close as possible to either a sub panel, your electric room, or the pole where you're going to put a new service, these are going to keep prices down and make your project more feasible. So just to start out with the DC chargers here, we're putting either the pole mounted transformer down to a new service equipment and then out to the chargers. And we can kind of put all those pieces in one little location there. Now, the other idea that we have here, and this is our building, by the way, so we do have chargers in sort of these locations, but just to give you a sense of the thought process of what we went through to make sure that we were designing the most cost effective and effective solution for us. So over on the right side, we have our existing transformer, and a really important point about DC charging to level 2 charging is the voltage. So a lot of buildings are on 208 volt, but all DC charging equipment is at 480 volt. Now, we were able to put a new transformer down next to our existing transformer and get 480 volt from that to run it out to our public DC fast charging equipment down below there. It's also important to note that there are specific rates for electric vehicle charging equipment. And in order to get the charging equipment on that rate, the only thing on that service is charging equipment.
And you're talking about utility rates, like billing rates.
Correct. So you have demand charges and supply charges. So you have a blended rate to mitigate some of the excessive demand charges that you would see from a DC fast charger. Now, it's not as important for a single level 2 charger to be on its own rate schedule, because you're not going to see a huge spike in your demand charges from a level 2. But if you were to put these DC stations behind your meter now, then you're going to see anywhere from 60 to 125 kilowatt demand spike in your bill every month, because you put this behind your existing meter. In order to put it on its own rate with its own specialized EV meter, you're going to need to pull a new service from the road.
And what is the cost savings in the charging rate schedule versus a regular commercial rate?
Now, Stefan, you might be able to talk a little bit more about rates than I can, but the idea is that I believe it's around 20 cents for per kilowatt hour for the blended rate. Now, if you are already seeing demand charges and they may be high, and then you're adding on the DC charging, which could be up to 125 kilowatts, and you may be paying, and Stefan, jump in here, anywhere from, I'd say, $20 a kilowatt for your demand rates. So if you can add in that 125 onto your current, you're looking at extra $300 just for the demand charges.
So here's how I would kind of summarize it. The fixed rate for an EV meter is about 20 cents. and it's just per kilowatt hour. Now your per kilowatt hour rate on most non-residential meters, so any municipal leader here who has to pay those bills, there's a lot of different charges on there. The kilowatt hour rates might only total up to about 12 or 13 cents. The demand component, yes, could be $15 to $20 per kW. So if you have 100 kW DC fast charger, that's $2,000. And that gets triggered if that EV charger is used only one time for 30 minutes during the course of a month. So EV charger, you know, if somebody plugs in for a half an hour, a few bucks. That's on the EV charger rate. If you're on, say, a rate 30 or some other type of non-residential service, you could be looking at a $2,000 bill for that same charging session. So metering is super important, and we look out for you. So one of the first things we ask our clients for when looking at a host site is, let's look at the electric bill. Let's see what the options and the implications are of such a load to make sure we're not setting you up for sticker shock later.
So along those lines, so it looks like your facility is a relatively new modern building. But let's say you're dealing with an old building that has inadequate electrical service as it is. I did see that you could charge a panel upgrades to allow for future expansion to this program. And that would be included. How much can you milk this for as a way of also upgrading the electrical service to the entire building, which might be substandard and inadequate already?
So in thinking about the level 2 incentive, and it's really going, that $20,000 is really going to go towards putting in 1 or 2 chargers and maybe wall mounted and their path to the electrical panel. When you're talking about an upgrade of an electrical service, I'm sure that a lot of the people on this call have done some site work and electrical work for on their buildings. It can get pretty costly in talking about electrical upgrades. So the level 2 incentive is stretched for the cap that it's in. It will really cover mostly just the charger and a simple path to the electrical panel.
So that would be exhausted by the 20,000.
Right,
Yeah.
with potentially some additional conduit and some additional upsizing of those branch circuits to handle additional chargers down the road. So, but it probably would not be sufficient to, like, I don't think that level 2 incentive would really be terribly supportive of your looking at a building that maybe has 100 amp service coming in and upgrading to like 200 or 400 amps or something along those lines. It's
Right.
probably, I don't think it's necessarily an out of bounds question, but I don't think it's going to be sufficient to make those types of upgrades. That would be a case where you might want to look at a dedicated service for that EV equipment.
Mhm.
And the make ready costs associated with the DC fast chargers are going to be a new service. So you wouldn't be able to leverage the $150,000 baseline or $250,000 environmental justice zone dollars to upgrade the building if the building's not actually feeding the chargers. And nor would you want to do that, because you would miss out on that EV rate rider and then have that huge electric bill going forward.
Right.
But we like the way you think, and we want to make sure that
Well-
things are future proofed. And if there's opportunities it brings some extra value to make sure it's a cohesive electrical design in the building or the new service coming in, absolutely. And we are an electrical contractor, so if that type of work is needed in the facility, we can provide options, ideas, and pricing.
Well, because what I'm thinking of is the longer term goal of, so I'm thinking of a facility that's it's all gas based, and having the option to switch over to electric services and replacing gas in the future. You're replacing oil or gas with let's say a heat pump or other things, but just not having the electrical service to be able to do those things. And could you leverage get some of the electrical upgrades you need to be able to support the replacement of carbon fuels? Yeah.
So it might not work out in the EV program, but Eversource does have fuel switching and energy efficiency programs and solar, all of which we're very fluent in. And there are some opportunities to combine these programs. So a
Well,
really
yeah,
interesting.
Could you do solar to actually generate the electricity that and roll that meter backwards that you're spending on charging? Yeah.
Yes, you can. So the EV meter that you install, you can't have any other loads on it other than the EV chargers. So you can't convert your whole building to the EV meter.
Okay.
But you can have the EV meter with the EV chargers and then have solar tied into that to feed in. And what's cool about municipalities is that you could reallocate any excess solar generation back to the facility on site. So we're not necessarily upgrading your existing infrastructure at the building, but like, let's take this image, for example. If you had a solar canopy or a ground array out in the field right now, where you can see this image where it's all dirt, you could put a solar array there, tie it into the EV, and have the excess solar energy that was created credited to the building. So there's a lot of
municipalities can do net metering that way.
correct. That's unique to municipalities and agricultural facilities. So again, we want to hear what the objectives are for the town across the board on energy, not just EV, because sometimes you're able to leverage the solar project into maybe a no-cost EV installation because it can just kind of get baked in. There's creative solutions by layering these incentives to build more value.
The other thing is, are school districts considered municipalities for this purpose?
Yes.
Yes, they would be.
Because DEEP is now having discussions about introducing electric school buses. So school buses will need charging, and if you compare that with the solar generation at the school, that could be a really interesting pairing.
Yes.
Yes, I would imagine that when I'm looking at this fleet charging over here on the left side of the screen, we're talking level 2 or DCFC for that specific fact. When we're looking at your DPW vehicles, maybe getting around town for officials, you're looking at Chevy Bolts or some type of passenger vehicle that would take level 2 charging. You park it overnight, you leave it there, it gets charged overnight, and then they use it throughout the day. Now, when we're talking about school buses that need a whole lot more power, and we're looking at a DCFC solution a lot of the time. So fleet charging can be much more complex than public or workplace in where you're trying to think about the route of the vehicle and when do you need it. And a lot of times they have scheduled charging for different vehicles if you have a multitude. And that's something that we are well equipped to help any municipality work through those solutions. So
another question is so Rivercog would be considered a municipality by the state, I think, but we currently lease our building. Is this, and our landlord has given us permission to install charging at Rivercog. Do you have to own, does the municipality or the COG have to own the building?
No,
the
just
municipality has to own the building for some layers of the program, but not specifically for EV. Sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to.
I was just answering on EV. You just have to provide a letter from the owner to be able to apply for the incentive.
From the landlord?
Yeah, from the landlord.
And how many years? So what happens if our lease? So are we on? Is the municipality or let's say the COG on the hook for a certain number of years? And how does that work?
The program is designed. They really want you to have these operational for 5 years.
And what if your lease is shorter than 5 years?
I can look into that. We haven't run into it too much, but
yeah, because I think we currently have a 3-year lease. I think we're in year 2, year 1. We just completed year 1 of a 3-year lease. We have options, I think, beyond that, but.
So we run into this on the solar side a lot because those contracts are usually 20 years.
Yes.
And if we're dealing with like a housing authority and they might have a lease that renews every 20 years or whatever. So generally the municipality has to act as a backstop. to that and say, all right, if Rivercog does not renew their lease and vacates the municipality, and I'm not the utility, we'd have to ask the utility for an official answer. But the precedent set in other programs and other types of situations where incentives were involved, that was usually the workaround.
And what does a backstop mean?
Meaning that if Rivercog was not there to facilitate, the continuous operation of that EV equipment for the remaining 2 years of the 5-year obligation, that the town they're basically giving an attestment that they will do that.
Because what I was thinking was, if we went in under the employer workplace program, and it is office space that we're renting, that our landlord could rent the office space to another tenant, and they would have the same workplace use of those chargers. But
Yeah,
for some period,
Yeah, so one of the municipalities that I've been speaking to, they're actually going to voluntarily do the workplace program, even though they want to make it available to the public. And it's because they haven't converted their fleet yet, but they intend to over time. And they want to reserve the right to restrict user access as their fleet grows, and they need to be able to rely on those spaces being available. So yeah, you're heading down the right path of trying to think ahead as to where that facility is going to be and what the needs are going to be as time moves on.
So in that situation, would you recommend that our landlord be the applicant as opposed to Rivercog?
I think that makes sense as a consideration. The other thing that is particularly on the level 2 stuff, much less likely on the DCFC, that equipment could be removed and taken with you to a new facility potentially.
Oh, okay.
I would think, and again, we're not Eversource, we would want them to officially kind of rule on all this, but my expectation would be, as long as that equipment was reinstalled somewhere and continued to be in compliance with sort of the networking requirements and whatever access requirements there might have been, that's something that could be worked through.
Yeah, and also I think if we go under the workplace program and it's office space and it gets rented to another office user who will then use it, the only issue would be maintaining that networking requirement for those 5 years.
So commonly it's common when we work on these projects that we work into the initial purchase a full 5 years of networking to eliminate that being an ongoing concern during that 5-year period.
Okay.
And because they're commonly cellular, you don't have to worry about handing over from one internet provider to the next, owned by the next tenant.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to imagine somebody changing the Wi-Fi password and realizing all of a sudden that they've got to run out to the chargers and connect them to new networks. It's much easier for everybody to have that stuff cellularly networked.
And then you get some nasty phone calls from Eversource. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
So to continue quickly here, we're in the center is our electrical room, and we run chargers out to the front of our building for workplace and for patrons coming in to talk to solar about us or vendors or whatever. We've made provisions to run chargers out to the back of our building. We're hopefully purchasing some electric trucks for our fleet vehicles in the future. Now we are installing a pretty large solar system on this roof that will be able to offset the costs of a lot of those chargers. Now we also have the DC chargers out at the bottom of our screen, and those are on separate rates. So we are using multiple avenues of charging in our facility, and just wanted to show it as kind of a use case that there's no one solution for everything. You have your DC chargers for your public use, or maybe you have electric buses. You have your workplace chargers for your employees or public use, and then down at the bottom left is an example of a fleet charger. So the big difference between the fleet charger at the bottom left and the workplace charger in the middle is that the fleet charger is not intended for currency exchange. It's specifically for personal use. So it it lacks some of the functionality of the middle charger, but it's kind of a workhorse, and there's different functionality for like scheduled charging of your vehicles and such like that. So the idea here is, start thinking about what your use case is and where is the best place to install. You really want to think about site work as a main focus. If your electrical room is on one side of the building, you really want to think about trying to put them as close to there as possible if it makes sense. It's going to keep costs down and it's going to make the projects more viable. So on the next slide,
Mike, the only other thing that I thought it might be worth pointing to
Yeah.
is that theoretically, many of these different locations would, for incentive purposes, qualify as different sites.
that is a great point. And that's what we leveraged as well, since they were on separate meters. And that's a big thing as well, that our public charging or DC fast charger was able to get the incentive. And then our workplace charger was on a separate meter, also able to get the level 2 incentive. And that's
So would that-
if your building has multiple meters already, that would automatically count as different sites because they're different meters.
it should, yeah.
This can be a kind of ambiguous part of the rules, and Eversource, sometimes you really have to bring them an example for them to decide exactly how they land on it. But that per site definition, there's a lot of wiggle room to take a building, a town hall or any sort of example, and by locating chargers in different parts of that facility on different sides of the building for different purposes, those are all possible avenues to get multiple incentive allotments. So that $20,000 or $150,000 or $40,000 or $250,000 incentive, that's not necessarily for a single building. Those can be for different sites, even on a single parcel.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. So our estimated project cost here is really to give you an idea of magnitude of scale between level 2 and DC. And we're showing baseline incentive to underserved incentive for these top two. So this baseline incentive, we're estimating $20,000 for a charge point system that has networking and is wall mounted next to, really in close relation to a electrical room. So you're not doing any site work. You don't have to pull in the concrete base for the bollard. You're not doing an excessive 200-foot run for, and the wiring that you're doing is through a relatively easy building. You're looking at $10,000 for the wiring, and you got $5,000 for the charger. And for there are some out-of-pocket costs, but that's to give you just a sense of a very simple to dual port public station. And again, to reiterate the incentives, to be able to do just 2 ports, it needs to be public station. Now, when we're moving down to the next, we have the underserved. Now I'm showing 2 dual port stations because the incentive is higher. Now these would be similar on the wall, relatively easy electrical, but you have a higher incentive, so it makes more sense to install 2 dual ports. Now, when we're thinking about future proofing, up in the first situation, we can install 1 but run the wires for 2, and you save some costs when you're trying to install the second dual port station. So site work can really run up the cost of your project, especially concrete work, because you want to make these things look really nice. So the concrete work involved, it can get expensive. So it's important to think about site work, trying to minimize site work to make the level 2 projects more viable.
And if I might jump in, Mike, some of the municipalities we've spoken to have volunteered their Department of Public Works to prep some of these sites ahead of our arrival to leverage town assets into a lower out-of-pocket expense. So we're absolutely open to that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're more than happy to work with your public works department to make these projects make sense. So moving down to the DC fast charger, you can see that we are an order of magnitude larger in the scope of the project. These chargers take a lot more to install, much heavier gauge wire, and you're installing an entire new service in there. Now, for that $150,000 rebate, it gets you pretty far, but there will be out-of-pocket cost. Comparably, when we have the underserved, that out-of-pocket cost is a lot less. But since the program rules state that you have 50% of the charger that is covered, and they're not covering networking, they're not covering maintenance, and they're not covering some line striping and bollard, there will be out-of-pocket costs no matter which way you're slicing it for any of these projects. It just depends on what the site conditions are, how long the run is, and what kind of chargers you're doing. It determines the size of that out-of-pocket cost. So we're just highlighting some past projects here. This is a DC fast charger project that we installed down at MJ Sullivan. We've done a lot of auto dealerships around the state. They're absolutely some of the first ones to adopt these DC fast chargers, and I think it'll be very helpful for them, for customers to understand DC fast charging as they purchase their vehicle and become part of the EV charging community. And with that, we can open it up for more questions. I know we're at 12:15, but happy to answer anything still on anybody's mind.
I just want to thank you for this presentation. It's very, very helpful and very interesting. And I also want to sort of just mention that this program through Eversource is also available to obviously any workplace, retailers, condominium complexes. So, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those same incentive matrices that we had up on some of the earlier slides apply to those examples.
But there's a finite amount of money, so, right?
And
My understanding is it's a 5-year program and that there's a certain level of funding available each year.
It is a 9-year program.
9-year program.
And they go in 3-year blocks.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
So right now we're moving through the first 3 years, and it seems as though the DC money is moving quite quickly. But that's where we're at.
And on the non-municipal side, if it's a for-profit entity, there could be some tax benefits as well that could reduce the net expense.
And just to help me here, you guys at Earthlink can sort of do the whole thing, right? From site planning to selection of equipment, cost estimates for maintenance, and annual operation, networking fees and whatnot.
Yes,
Soup to nuts.
we can be a turnkey provider. So we gave some examples of some cases where it has made sense for municipalities to do some site work, for example, themselves, and that's something that we're very happy to work with you guys as needed to help make projects make sense. But we are prepared to help you from point A to point to the completion of the project, having the equipment operational, installed, and ready for access.
And
Okay.
that also includes incentive applications and any sort of utility work requests and that part of the project as well.
Yeah, if I was to say where the limitations of our services might come in, when the job is done, if we had to cut through like a parking lot, or if we're going to patch it, we're not going to be repaving parking lots. At some point, a landscaping or excavating contractor might need to be brought in for larger landscaping repairs.
Okay.
Hi,
Well, we're
Ryan.
looking-
Excuse me, would you mind going back a couple slides just to see those monetary compensation and costs? Thank you.
Okay, in Chester, we're looking at a couple of locations, some municipal parking lots to install level 2 chargers. In both cases, the parking lots are unpaved. One already has a service. It's a 100 amp service, but there is a service there. The other has to cross from the utility pole, across a sidewalk in a small paved area to an unpaved section of the parking lot. So one requires a new service, one would either be existing service or a service upgrade. To be quite honest with you, we've talked to a couple of vendors in terms of the charging equipment. And the problem we're running into is that getting cost estimates from electricians who haven't had an opportunity to work with any of this equipment in the past is proving somewhat of a challenge. So that's why I'm interested in your turnkey solution.
We're very comfortable with estimating new services with the utility and are in the process of a number of those projects right now.
So it'd be possible to set up a meeting with you on site here in Chester to review what our goals are and have you come back with an estimate, the total project costs and what
Yeah.
costs would be covered.
Yeah, I would suggest let's set up a Zoom meeting after this so we can go over the site and we can derive preliminary project estimates before getting on site and then
Okay.
and working through the process that way.
Okay, and who would I set that up with, of the three of you?
So the last slide here, this email inbox, if you send an inquiry here, we will work internally to get the right person to reach out to you to help you and start to initiate that process.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, any other questions?
Yeah, I just had a quick question on the cell service that's used to speak to the stations. What is that outside of the 5-year window? Because if you're a municipality and you have multiple chargers, that cell cost could start to add up.
Yeah, so those cellular charges are typically wrapped into the networking agreements. So those agreements are can be it varies by provider, but it's typical of them to offer the ability to sign up for that networking for in increments of 1 year to like 5 years, and maybe even sometimes potentially further. But 1 to 5 years is pretty typical from what we've seen. And so we typically will recommend that you purchase 5 years of networking in the initial agreement, and then after those initial 5 years, you have options depending on the equipment. That one of the questions earlier we had discussed some EV charging hardware is pretty vertically integrated with a manufacturer provided networking solution, and then other sets of hardware have the ability to be a bit more open and could potentially explore other options. And those are the kinds of things that we would want us to think through, what makes sense to you on the initial project design process to make sure that we were proposing equipment that would sort of meet your expectations of how you would continue with those agreements further down the road.
And we can show you what those annual costs are at today's rates.
Okay.
We wouldn't necessarily be able to say this is the same rate that would be offered at year 6.
Right. And that's
But at least you
for something like, say, looking really far down the road, you've got a public works facility and you've electrified the whole thing. The town wants to go and just have their IT people network it. Like, is that possible? But I'm assuming at installation, you would want to have those connections, those wires in the ground. So you really have to think about that well ahead of time.
Yeah, some of our manufacturing partners have equipment that can be done either way. So it might be for the first 5 years you do cellular, but then after that you bring the IT department in to hardwire everything, because now you've got 10 or 12 of these things. You don't want to have 12 cellular plans. So we want to make sure that the equipment we install on day one doesn't preclude that option in the future. So it's all about telling us your plans and letting us know so we can set you up for the long haul.
Perfect. Thank you.
I know it was mentioned earlier, but are we going to be getting the slide deck for this presentation?
Yeah, we can email that over to Sam for sure.
Thank you.
Great. Well, and also we are recording this, so we can share this recording with other towns who weren't able to attend as well. So, all right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for setting it up.
And I'm sure some of us are going to be in touch with you, and we will get this video out to our other town members and with your contact info, so they can follow up with you as well. And I may be reaching out to you personally about a condo project as well. So
We eagerly await every single contact we get and look forward to working with each and every one of you.
great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Earthlight.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting us.
All right. Goodbye.